Well, I guess I'll introduce myself here first. I'm Andrea Miller. I am a family finding trainer at Connect Our Kids. I have experience as a foster family recruiter, um, and I have also been trained in the 30 Days to Family concept. And then, in addition to that, I am a previous foster kid myself. Um, I have a twin sister. We grew up in foster care and we had about 11 different families, and then we're adopted at 18. Um, and, because of that, I do this work today. So we're here because we're going to talk about, your work on our team, what you do. And we're going to talk about, being trauma informed and some of the practices that you use as a trauma therapist. So, Beth, I guess you've been doing this, you said, specifically working in child welfare for 4 years and in the space for 10. So, could you just quickly tell everyone what you do and how long you've been doing it?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2013, I graduated with my master's in clinical counseling, and my first role out of graduate school was working with children and families in foster kinship and adoptive families. So that was really my first experience with the child welfare system. I knew nothing about it at that point going into it. I had my degree, I had my training, and I had a specialty in trauma in my degree, but I really had never worked with children and families, and I didn't even know anybody who had ever been involved with the child welfare system. So it was a bit of a shock for me at first, but what I realized pretty quickly on was that I was able to I was able to make a lot of progress with the families because they really didn't have any education or knowledge about trauma at that time. So I spent the bulk of my work and saw the most progress made with families when I would help the caregivers, the foster parents, become trauma informed and trauma responsive with the children in their home.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And And you are also a CASA or a court appointed special advocate,
Yes.
if you don't know the industry lingo. I have some questions for you just about some of your experiences as a CASA and as a trauma informed counselor. So, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was so, when a child enters the system, there's a lot of trauma. I mean, even just the removal is traumatic, right? So, and there's a lot of trauma within the family and between the family members that can make advocacy work kind of difficult or tricky. So, what are some of the situations that you run across or that you encounter, and what about your trauma informed training and background is helpful for you in that kind of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest lessons for me to learn was that trauma is intergenerational, which means that it gets passed down from family to family member through the generations. And there's often a lot of sort of negative talking and negative opinions about birth families in the early days of my career. And not from me, but just in general, it was like, they were looked down upon as, for making their mistakes and for the things that had brought their children into care. But the more I understood trauma, the more I realized that these parents were actually, victims of trauma themselves and that they were trying to cope with the trauma they endured in the best way they knew how. And often that was by turning to substances, which then land their children in care. And so you can see how that cycle can continue to repeat itself if it's not interrupted. So I really work with the families to try and help stop that cycle from repeating itself by providing the children opportunities to process their trauma, to address their grief, because there's a lot of grief that underlies the losses that have taken place in their lives and by being in foster care, but also being able to try and find positive connections to their birth family, whether or not they can be in each other's lives. I always try to help people understand that knowing something positive about your birth family is so important to your self-identity, to your sense of groundedness in the world, and to your ability to, be successful in life. You really need to know something good about where you came from. Otherwise, you internalize all those bad messages that you've heard about your birth family, and that just makes you feel bad and you feel unworthy of being able to achieve the things you want to achieve.
As someone who's experienced myself, lots of trauma, after learning about generational trauma, it helped me to almost find forgiveness for my biological parents for the circumstances that I landed in. And I think we probably can all agree that forgiving someone else can help you, to heal. So I love what you're saying here about how important it is to at least have some kind of connection to your biological family. And I would also even throw into your community that you came from. We talk all the time about connections matter, and I think that's probably why we both do the work that we do. And so I did have another question. A lot of times when kids come into care, we hear stories about parents who maybe aren't willing to have their extended relatives contacted, or they don't feel good about it. Maybe there's some shame. They don't want their relatives to know that their child has been taken into foster care, or there's some fractures in the family. As a with your trauma training, how might you address a situation like that? Or if you've got parents that aren't willing for their biological family to be contacted, or initially aren't comfortable with it?
Yeah. So, I think it all comes down to building trust with the people you're interacting with. And so, it takes time and patience for that trust to grow. But being a good listener and really hearing the person and being present with them and their story. And even if it's, even if they're saying no, and finding out why, what are the reasons, try to get at the root of what it is that is holding them back, and validating that and empathizing with how hard that must be, and giving them a space to think about it, to talk about it, process it, can sometimes open up willingness to consider those connections to be made. So, really just trying to connect in a way that is not just, oh, I'm just here to get this job done, but no, I care about you. I want to hear your story. You're heard. When you spend time with me, you feel heard. You feel understood. And if you can create that kind of relationship with a biological parent or a biological family member who might have some pushback on these connections, you're more likely to see positive change and consideration of these extended family member connections.
Amazing. I think it's so important that we focus more on listening,
Yeah.
like you say, than talking. And this is a concept that's not new. It's used in the sales world, which I've worked in, and it's used in therapy. And pretty much all of us, we've been in some kind of a relationship or another, and we all like to feel heard, right? So, can you give an example for the folks who might be um, listening, it's just as an example of how you might reflect, or, what does being a good listener look like to you when a parent gives you one of those objectives? What might you literally say in response?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because yeah, we can talk about it, but we need to sometimes hear those concrete examples. So what it looks like is, well, first listening without interrupting or speaking or um, you know interjecting your thoughts and feelings, but trying to listen without preparing a response to really hear what they're saying. So don't be thinking necessarily about what you're going to say next, but just hear the words, hear what they're saying, and then reflect back to them verbally. It sounds like you feel really uncomfortable with us connecting with your extended family members, and just leave it right and wait. Let it be awkward if you need a space or a moment, but just wait. And eventually they will fill that space and tell you more about why. And so when you can figure out, what's really going on a little bit deeper, you might be able to find some reasons why those connections might actually help their situation and help the child. Um, so yeah, so that's what the reflecting is. It's stating what you heard and like it sounds like you feel or think X, Y, Z, and then just waiting for them to respond.
I love that method. It's tried and true. um, and I think we forget as people who work in the industry and as people who exist with other people. Coexisting with other people can be a challenge. So I think this is important for every relationship, but I think it's extra important when we're working in the child welfare space and we're really trying to prioritize the needs of the children and also the needs of their family. Um, you know, we talk about parent pain points, and those are delicate situations, and we're kind of learning how we have those conversations. But one of the things that I hear a lot in what I do, and so I train CASAs all over the country, and I used to be a foster family recruiter, so some of the objections that I hear I wanted to share with you and see if you could just give a response and how, as a trauma informed therapist, you might respond to this. So, first of all, an objection that you might have just from the social worker or the CASA, there's this mindset that gets perpetuated that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So sometimes that's a stereotype that gets pushed that, abuse people, or, if the mom and dad weren't able to provide, the extended relatives, therefore, may not be able to as well. And so they might just write them off as unavailable. And it breaks my heart when I hear this, and, I'm advocating for what I know these kids deserve. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would respond to that by pointing out that, there is always change taking place. We actually we do a really bad job as humans at being able to predict what will be like in the future, right? So like we don't even if you tried to picture yourself 10 years from now, and then 10 years from now you're yourself, you probably will have a terrible prediction about where you'll be or what you'll be doing. You actually don't really you can't really make those predictions well. So I think part of it is just pointing out those examples of maybe sometimes uh, where where we think one thing and it turns out to be another, can be helpful, trying to find those examples in their own life. I think it's important to educate them about positive childhood experiences, which is research recently completed by Johns Hopkins University about how our connections to one another can heal and even mitigate trauma for children long term. So it reduces poor mental health and social outcomes for children, the more supportive connections that they have around them. And that research is super powerful. And we can see that when we make the effort to have those connections, that we can reduce suffering for children and adults. What we know about our brain is that we have neuroplasticity with our brain, and so we can change over time all the way up through our 80s and 90s. Our brain is still changing. It's much more malleable when we're in our younger years, so the sooner we get these connections to children, the better, and we know that we can change the brain.
That's exactly where I actually was going to go after this. So there's an old cliche, it takes a village to raise a child, right? That applies to everyone. We know that it's not one person could do it alone. And kids need more than one person can give. But you just touched on one big thing, and I think that we might find in our work in family finding, I have found many times, and I think the people who will use our technology may run into this, is exactly what you were saying. There's, these stereotypes or cliches that foster kids are broken, they're ill behaved, they're going to be abusive, whatever that may be. So, for the folks who are doing this work, they're on the ground. How would you advise them to, respond when they reach out to a family member that, they're doing this family connection, eco mapping for a child, and they run into this objection? How would you advise them to handle that or
Yeah,
overcome
well,
that objection?
it's interesting because when I came into the field, like I said, it was my first introduction to child welfare at that point, and what I realized was how incredibly amazing the children in foster care were. I was blown away by their ability to handle and cope with what they're going through. So the more time you spend with children in foster care, the more you realize how false those myths are that have been perpetuated by, society and our culture and media and things like that. But when you're actually on the ground in those relationships, you see it right away, just how incredible they are. They inspired me to have a family because I wasn't sure if I wanted to have children before that role, and being close to them and seeing their determination and their ability to overcome and overcome and overcome really inspired me. So, I think that myth gets easily broken when you spend time together with people, and you get to see the real people. And that takes risk, right? That there's a risk involved there. And I know that's not easy. But we have to be brave enough to step into those relationships and see that those myths are quickly shattered.
It kind of also drives us into another thought that I had, which is, we just talked about, you reach out to a family member and you're met with the objection that the child might be ill behaved or they're perpetuating those stereotypes. But that aside, what about when you reach out to an extended relative and you're met with anger? They're frustrated, they're hurt, they had no idea that this was going on with the child, that they may have been abused or neglected, and that, they weren't able to support or stop that. How can you, and the folks who are out here doing the work, boots on the ground, how can they respond to that kind of situation, and help those adults?
Yeah, sure. So whenever I start a difficult conversation, I always preface it with, if you can give people a little bit of mental space to prepare for what you're about to say, it actually lands a little bit easier. So when you get on the phone or if you're emailing, you always want to, the first sentence is always, what I'm about to say might be a little difficult to hear. And then it gives your brain just a second to like orient to, okay, I gotta, first of all, you have my attention, and number two, this might be hard to hear, and asking if it's a good time to talk too, like, this is important, this might be difficult to hear, is this a good time for you? That's going to build some trust, and they may say, you know what, I'm in the middle of a meltdown with my 5-year-old right now. I can't have this conversation right now. But it shows respect for the person on the other end of the phone or on the other end of the computer if you're on Zoom or whatever it might be. And that way, you're finding a good time where they actually can take in some of this information. And then beyond that, it's leading with your. Sometimes you can lead with your own feelings. So, this is even hard for me to talk to you about. Like, this was even a hard phone call for me to make because I know that this might be upsetting for you. I know that this might affect your life in some way, and letting them know that you're concerned about their well-being and you're not judging them for who they are. Um, it can really disarm people, and make that connection a little bit easier, make that conversation a little bit easier. It also has to share something about your own life, so you can build trust with the people on the other end of the phone or whatever it is by sharing a little bit about your own life and your own struggles. So being a little vulnerable, opening up and saying, you know, so I felt this way before too. I've felt this way before too, and try to think of a story. that aligns with is going on with that person right then and there. Like, there was a time when I got a really shocking phone call too, or really unexpected information too, and I know it can be really tough. So it's trying to open up a little bit, be a little vulnerable with people, and give them the respect they deserve to be prepared for the information that you're about to share.
Amazing. And I think, that can kind of feed into what we were talking about earlier, which was that active listening, repeating back what they've said and letting them feel what they're feeling too, right? Beth, we are so indebted to you for the work that you do for your CASA kids and for the Connections Matter Academy. Thank you so much for all these tips and tricks and your trauma informed training podcast, I guess, that we've done today. You are awesome. Thank you so much, Beth Tyson.
Thank you. I'm honored to be a part of it all, and I'm thankful to be here today with you. Thank you.
You're welcome.